Welcome, friends, to a presentation on the story of Bob, the life and times of Reverend Robert W. Wood. I am Mark Bowman, Executive Director of the LGBTQ Religious Archives Network, the host of tonight's program. LGBTQ RAN is a unique venture dedicated to preserving the history of LGBTQ religious movements around the world. LGBTQ RAN is a digital enterprise. We are not a physical repository that stores papers. We advise and support leaders and groups in their efforts to preserve their records in appropriate archives. Furthermore, we collect and provide a treasure of historical information on our website about LGBTQ plus persons and groups from a wide array of religious expressions around the world. And finally, we encourage research and scholarship in queer religious history. Tonight, we have a treat, learning about one of the earliest pioneers in LGBTQ religious movements in the U.S., United Church of Christ minister Robert Wood. His story is being told by Stephen Law, who did many interviews and research with Bob to ensure that his story would be preserved. Stephen will be interviewed by a historian, Bernard Schlager, PhD, of the Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies in Religion, also known as CLGS, who is co-hosting tonight's program with us. LGBTQ RAN has a long history of association with CLGS, and so, Bernie, it is a delight to co-host this program with you.
Thank you, Mark. It's always a privilege to do work with LGBTQ Religious Archives Network. As Mark mentioned, we have a long history together. CLGS, we are located at Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California. We are also celebrating our 25th anniversary this year in 2025-2026. And we serve four distinct communities in the work that we do in the areas of education, research, advocacy, and community building. And that's primarily faith communities, the world of academic religious scholarship, and then LGBTQ people, our families, and spiritual and faith communities. So again, welcome on behalf of LGBTQ RAN and CLGS to this interview, discussion, conversation with Stephen Law. Before we begin, I'd like to offer a brief introduction of Stephen to let you know about this author of the book, The Story of Bob. Stephen C. Law is a writer whose work bridges faith and cultural engagement. His commitment to compassionate storytelling enriches the story of Bob with insight and empathy. Stephen holds degrees from Campbell University and Colgate-Rochester Crozier Divinity School, where his focus was Christian ethics and social policy. As an ordained pastor, he has served rural and urban churches before studying creative writing with C. Michael Curtis. Chief among Stephen's accomplishments are 45 bliss-filled years with Dr. William Donald Stroud, with whom he created Découvert Fine Art, an art gallery specializing in European master drawing. He is the founder and president of the Law Stroud Foundation, and he lives in Rockport, Massachusetts. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you, Bernie.
Thank you for being a part of this conversation.
And thank you also for being willing to engage with me.
You are most welcome. You know, it was in 1988 that I first met Bob Wood. I met him twice. I had stumbled across his remarkable book that he had published in 1960, and the name of the book is Christ and the Homosexual. And I was teaching a course on U.S. LGBTQ history, and I was stunned to stumble across this book that had been published by Bob at deep financial cost to him. Mm-hmm. And it opened my eyes to the fact that here was a UCC minister who was serving a congregation who had published a very detailed and at times surprisingly frank book on homosexuality and Christianity. I wanted to interview him for some research I was doing, so I telephoned him to set up a meeting with him in New Hampshire, and I was taken aback by his directness and the firmness with which he wanted to know my intentions, my motives. And not soon after we began our conversation, and I say this with deep respect, he wanted to know if I knew how important he was to the LGBTQ movement, as we call it now. So I was a little taken aback. I saw him as a force of nature. And then once I arrived in New Hampshire to visit him, I was taken by his charm, by his frankness, and his passion for telling the story of his life. And so when several years ago you shared your manuscript with me, I learned even more about Bob and his life. And so what I know from reading the book and from talking to you is that you first reached out to Bob Wood after reading about the death of his partner. And one question I have to open our conversation is, how did that initial pastoral visit on your part evolve into a 5-year biographical project? And at what point in visiting Bob did you know that you were writing a book about him?
Well, that's a great question. And I remember it like yesterday, but just reading an article about someone who had lost a longtime lover. And I was with Donald, and I said to Donald, this person could use a visit of a pastoral nature. So I called Bob as a cold call out of the blue, like you did, Bernie, and told him that I was very sad for the news of the passing of Hugh, asked if he would be interested in having a visit, a pastoral visit of sorts. He was living in a retirement village in Concord, New Hampshire at the time. I don't think he had a real sense of gay community around him. He was basically living in a heteronormative environment, which we all are really at the end of the day. And so he welcomed that call and encouraged me to come. And when I went to visit him and walked through the door for the first time, I really had no expectations, only curious. And the truth was he was just overwhelmed by grief. That's the truth. And as soon as I walked into the little apartment where he was living, I could take in the decor there. He had hanging on the walls these different paintings that Hugh had made. One particularly remember it very vividly because it was a cowboy, a painting of a cowboy that hung over Bob's bed. And there were two strange dolls, and I think of them as dolls. They were like cowboy dolls on a little counter in his bedroom, sort of embracing one another. And I thought, well, that's something. And there were like glass hats, which indicated his interest in antique glass hats, and photos of the two of them traveling in the Holy Land together, and a small desk for writing. And we settled in his living room finally, and he just began to weep openly. And I listened, and I was just present for him in grief and sympathizing with him and acknowledging his loss. And after a long period of time, I don't know how long it took him to ask you any question about yourself. After a long period of time, there was like one little moment, and he would say, well, tell me a bit about you.
Yeah.
And so I shared briefly that I was with Donald, the love of my life, and that I was taking this writing course with Mike Curtis, who was the editor at the Atlantic Monthly at the time. And our focus in that writing group was short fiction, specifically, primarily, only. So I was writing short fiction, had no intention on writing a story about Bob, none. But before I left, he asked me if I thought I would be interested to write a book that would honor his life with Hugh, and that was primary for him at the time, and his work as an advocate for gay rights, which he named also for me, as he did for you. And I said to him, well, I don't know you. I don't know what your activism is. Let me talk to Mike about it, and let me be back in touch with you. And Mike agreed to meet me in Boston. We had lunch together, And Mike said, well, I've seen your writing. It's not that you couldn't do that, but do you really want to commit yourself to a story that might take many years to evolve? Why don't you ask him for 6 months to see if a story is compelling enough for you to take on as a project? But he warned me not to make any promises in terms of publishing because the publishing world, as you know, Bernie, is very unpredictable. And to make promises like that would be unethical. So I asked him if he would agree to that, and he said yes. And about 2 weeks later, I showed up with you know, at the time it was just writing. I wasn't even using a computer. I was just writing interviews with him to begin with, making notes. And I, you know, that's how it began.
Yeah, and I love knowing or hearing again that in fact this began as a pastoral visit,
right.
and then turned into telling the story of Bob.
Yeah.
There is, of course, an oral history dimension in the book that you've written, and I know you mentioned in the book that Bob's archives are at the Congregational Library in Boston, and I visited there as well, and it was wonderful to read through some of his diaries and prayers. And I'm curious to know, after you made the decision to write the book, how did you structure and conduct your interviews with Bob? And I'm wondering about some of the challenges that might have been present when working with someone who was in the final years of their life. So did you make recordings at all? Was
yes.
it all freehand? Yeah. So tell us a bit about how you structured these oral history interviews with Bob.
Well, so you had mentioned in a question that's told too, has been noted in the book.
Right.
It's not exactly accurate. I did, and I'm going to channel Mike Curtis here for a minute because what I was learning in writing short fiction, I was trying to make an application to this project. And the first question that came to my mind to ask Bob was to name for me those moments in his life that held emotional weight. Now, everybody that's listening to this can just take a minute and think. It doesn't take long for you to begin to sort through in your own memories what moments hold emotional weight for you. Of course, immediately, and I'll name a few here for the purposes of those that might have read the book, he was recalling the war years. It was loaded with emotional weight. His conversations with Fred Eigler at the University of Pennsylvania, where he was being, called out for being a queer, and where his whole career was in jeopardy before it even began. The death of his father was a big one that showed up right off the radar screen, and we weren't putting in this in any kind of order. We were just allowing them to unfold as naturally as our conversation is unfolding here tonight. His father's death, his mother's death, all these kinds of things began to just evolve on a list to begin with. Another list then included any turning point you could name. Can you name in your life any time when you were going in one direction and suddenly you had a shift in understanding or you had a change in your life direction? That was a little bit more complicated for him to take in, but we got a list of those as well. And then we began to turn some of those into writing sketches or written sketches, like little, I don't know, drawings in written form. They began to be populated with the characters that were germane to those specific instances. Then, because memory, you mentioned being with an older person, memory for everybody is a little bit suspect, right? So I began to feel some inconsistency in what he was saying and what was the chronology that we were trying to keep track of as well. Then we got to the hard material that you had mentioned that the Congregational Library has. The war diaries, the sermon notes, and certain details stood out from those immediately, again, that held emotional weight, like the Q written in the war diary. Everybody can, if you've read the book, you know what I mean. That Q was just a simple letter written in pencil in his war diary, and I asked him about it, and that prompted the memory of passing a stockade in which men were being held with Q's on their back, meaning that they were awaiting dishonorable discharge. And I thought, wow, here it goes. And we began to just build a narrative to construct it. And we also created a list of people from that needed to be interviewed in a similar way to verify the facts as we were understanding, to make changes if necessary. Fortunately, they were all living in the Northeast, and I could get to them basically within a day or two's drive. But again, for me, as a person that was rather, I don't know, not sheltered, but conservative, I've been one man in my life, and not too many sexual experiences to speak of. I'm boring by most people's standards in the LGBTQ world. I'm absolutely a dinosaur. But then all of a sudden, I was in Manhattan in a sadomasochistic subculture, learning that other people had different ways of arranging their fantasies and thoughts and ideas. And I called Donald from New York. I said, I'm not in Kansas anymore. I said, I was knowing that I was being waked up to many things that I didn't understand personally, and that somehow was going to have to be remaining non-judgmental in relationship to. And so all that, and I hope it's not too much information all at once.
Yeah, no, really helpful.
That all began to coalesce into a narrative that was in the third person originally, and that narrative was evolved for I think 4 years, about twice as long in size as what this narrative is. And I began to workshop some of that narrative with my writing class. 2 points came up as a concern. One, that there were competing voices, my voice and the voice of Reverend Wood and others. And that was a problem to be solved. And the other problem was the lack of internal dialogue or feelings. And many people from Bob's generation, especially if they've been in the war, I think the psychology of war shuts them down psychologically. And he could describe things from the war quite easily, like a journalist, mortar rounds, geography, platoon habits, what was expected of him as a soldier, basic training. But if you ask him how he felt about any of it, he couldn't name it. He just couldn't articulate it. And so it was a real problem for the workshopping of the earliest chapters. And then that led to my having the awareness of problems that needed to be solved. And like in the 4th and 5th year, I shifted from the third person into the first person, which demands the immediacy of feelings in the internal life. If you're reading a narrative in the first person and it's not present, you'll stop reading. So that was a real strategy on my part to get at that. And I had to make them up at the end of the day, just make them up like a piece of fiction. And then when I gave him the chapters to read in the first person, and he would get to those points in which feelings were articulated, he would begin to weep and say, you got it. But it was a process.
And it reads well. I mean, the movement from scene to scene and experience to experience. I reread the book over the weekend, as I mentioned earlier, and it flows well chronologically. My next question.
I'm so grateful to hear that. That was my ambition. Mike Curtis, if he were still living, would be very proud to have heard that too, because he was a great editor, a genius of an editor, and I feel so lucky to have had my work in front of him.
Yeah. And so my next question, I say out of deep respect for Bob, and I sincerely believe that his generation made life easier for me. I was born in 1960. So I want to ask this with deep respect, and that is, in reading the book and having met Bob twice, I know that he carried many secrets for decades and decades about his sexuality, his private life, the way in which he compartmentalized his public, private selves, his ministry, the face that he showed to the public. I'm curious to know, how did you build the trust necessary for him to open up? And were there moments, I'm not asking for information, but were there moments where he felt he was not willing to go when it came to talking about himself and his life?
Well, that's a great question because, the thing is, I learned right away that I was going to have a dual role. I was going to be a recorder of facts, but I was also going to be a therapist of sorts. So some of the training that I had in Jungian psychotherapy at Colgate and active listening skills, they became pretty handy at times when, there seemed to be an unwillingness or even just a lack of recall. And there was trauma, obviously buried trauma related to the war experience. Sometimes he had access to it. Sometimes it was just too painful. And I had to learn how to be, as many therapists do, I had to learn to be asking the right questions and being attentive in non-judgmental format, and to sometimes wait and let the silence fill the room. I mean, those were very awkward moments, because, when someone is resistant to sort of visit the traumas in their life, it's really hard to be impatient. And the thing is, I knew I wasn't a therapist to help him heal. I was a therapist because I had to get the damn information. And then it was a strange kind of awkwardness related to the role I was playing. I needed to get clarity about the facts, and I, at the same time, was very much aware that part of it was therapeutic in nature.
And I think the strength of your identifying the multiple roles you played shows in the book, and the quality of the narrative that you create. One of the most dramatic moments of Bob's life is when he is shot right near Monte Cassino in Italy during the Second World War. He has a bullet go through his chest, right, and then has a deep bayonet wound. I'm also aware, as many of us in the room here tonight, that Bob engaged in activism in the homophile movement, as it was called then, in the 1950s and 60s, with a bravery that is quite stunning, and often wearing his clerical collar. And in your discussions with Bob, did he ever make a connection between the courage he showed in that long experience of being wounded and the recovery that it took, and the courage he brought to activism? Especially, those were the places where he showed the public that he was a minister.
What an amazing question. I have to say that writing about his war life, to me, was the hardest part of the whole endeavor. I was not in the military, and I didn't go to war, but I felt like I was present in a real way. And I think that is a very difficult thing from people who have not been in combat to understand, just what you said. And it really takes a toll. And so when I was in that room with that material, I was very much touched by it personally, and aware, as you are, of his extraordinary courage to be present as a soldier. But I thought about that question. I'm thinking about that question and the whole notion of courage in combat or in activism. I'm not sure, believe it or not, I'm not sure that Bob would use the word courage in relationship to himself. And to me, that strikes or reminds me of something that there was also about him that I loved very much was there was a humility. It took a while to surface sometimes when he was in this,
Yeah,
this see me mode.
yeah.
But I think that if he were here, I think especially in combat, my thinking, he would say it was all about preparation and unit cohesion and keeping up and not letting your comrades down. And he was doing everything he could physically. You could feel it, his physical participation in boot camp and, and understanding that all of the soldiers that were embarking in the war effort together were going to be they were going to be in harm's way in a serious way. And he had a sense that I just want to do my part. I don't want to let down the teammates. I really wouldn't want to be called out sleeping on the job. And so I want to do my best to be physically present and to understand the rules of combat and to be present in those. In activism, it was almost the same.
Mm-hmm.
By then, it was a faith that was informed by a disciplined scholarship and ideas. And the action was derived from the faith ideas. It didn't take him courage. It took intelligence and thought and discipline to work through the complexity of theological ideas.
Mm-hmm.
But once he sort of had it in his mind, like what the prophets might require of him, or even what the teachings of Jesus might require of him, it
Yeah,
wasn't courage. It was something else. It was, I don't know, faithfulness, maybe.
it's faithfulness and tenacity, right? That he
Yeah.
had. Um, one of the most moving parts of the book for me was the way in which you incorporate Bob's relationship with Psalm 91. So during the trauma of the war experience and afterwards, he is reading, rereading, and praying Psalm 91. And that made me wonder how central was Scripture to his survival in many parts of his life, because many of us who are LGBTQ have experienced Scripture many ways, including as a weapon used against us. And Bob certainly saw the Bible used in that way.
Mm.
But Psalm 91 was really a personal lifeline for him. Literally, as the bullets are flying about him, as he's tragically walking over dead bodies on Monte Cassino. Did he speak about Scripture when you spoke with him about his life journey?
Very much so. And I think it came in several parts.
Mm-hmm.
It came in the part of a childhood introduction to faith ideas. And I like to think of it now as that even as a child, there was some sort of network of ideas that were religious in nature that sort of formed in his head.
Mm-hmm.
Very basic idea. Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. These kinds of very simple ideas. God is great, God is good. Let us give thanks. God is making the sun shine, God creates the rain. God will take care of me as a little boy because God loves me if I ate right, acted right, and obeyed adults. I mean, so that conditional thing was circled in there in the childhood business. So there was this sort of network of ideas that were, part of a formation of sorts, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's also supported by his family's faith. So when he goes to war, his mother sends him this prayer, beautiful prayer that she finds in some book somewhere, a prayer that simply asks God to take care of that son of hers and to watch over him. I get really, very hooked by this because I don't think there's a single mother in the
Yeah.
whole world that would not want their son protected or their daughter protected in combat. And I just feel that little detail gets me every single time to have had a mother send him a prayer. And he said of that prayer, he kept it like a blanket of protection. It was like some sort of mythic thing. And yeah, I think he thought of prayer getting him through the whole combat
Mhm.
experience, the prayer of church people. He felt like somehow he was going to make it because, people were praying for him. I love
Mhm.
that idea about a community yearning out of their love for another human being, prayerful thoughts. I love the idea of prayer as a form of empathy in the world. I get touched by that all the time. And I try to remind people who don't want to pray anymore, well, don't give up on it.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, think of it as an empathetic exercise. Think of it, if nothing else, as you loving the people that you love and hold them up. You can't make the world safe for the people you love. You can't physically do it,
Yeah.
but you can
And
pray for it.
as you're speaking, Stephen, I'm reminded of that moment or moments in your biography where after he's been recuperated in northern New York, comes back home to Fairhaven, Vermont. I'm 20 miles north of Fairhaven, Vermont right now, in Shoreham, Vermont, where one of our participants will recognize the name of the town. And Bob preaches
Yeah.
at the Congregational Church in Fairhaven and says that the entire church joined his mother in weeping, in crying, as they celebrated the fact that he had survived.
Isn't that a beautiful detail?
Yeah, very beautiful, very good, and I can see it. I know the church building.
So
Um,
coming back to Psalm 91 for just a minute that you had
sure.
mentioned. So he leaves that shortly after he comes home and he goes back to the University of Pennsylvania, where he now has a calling to serve God, right? It's in those years that you're naming when he's coming back from the war that Psalm 91 is most meaningful, because he really was having all sorts of nightmares. He could not get himself settled into a civilian life. He could have very well become, very dysfunctional
Mhm.
in that. I mean, we ask people to do god awful things, and then we ask them to return to home and return to a normal life. It's almost impossible. And he
Mhm.
was having all these nightmares, all this. He was having people show up at the house talking about their dogs, and he wanted to just scream, "Don't you understand that people are getting killed? I don't really care about your fucking dog." I'm sorry, but that's
Yeah.
what I felt coming from him. That he couldn't help, that he couldn't tolerate the normal life because this war was living inside of him. Psalm 91 was what helped him calm himself down. This
Mhm.
whole business of reading something about God in heaven, some form of God in heaven, being a form of protection, holding him under his wing, keeping harm from coming to him. He just read it over and over.
And
Like,
protecting one from the arrows that fly, right? By as he's experiencing these bullets.
yeah, and I do think, as you said, that that's what helped him to come
Yeah.
into his life enough to move forward to pursue a calling to serve God, which was the only thing that he found meaning in doing, having
Yeah.
lost so many friends, not making sense out of life in any real terms. I think the calling to serve God was the only thing he could find to do that had any meaning.
Yeah. Pivoting a bit here, Stephen, the scene that you paint at the death of his husband, Hugh, is really devastating, right?
Mm.
A police officer asks Bob the nature of their relationship, and Bob struggles and then answers with, "I'm Mr. Coulter's pastor." And then days later, to a parishioner, something breaks open in Bob, and he says, "He wasn't just my friend, he was my lover." And I'm wondering if you read that as a threshold moment where I don't want to read too much into it, but what I wanted to see in that and what I took from it was this a grief that was longstanding, right, till the rest of Bob's life, for the rest of Bob's life? Did that grief in some way free him and allow him to, as he did, come out as a gay man?
Here's an irony. It comes back to the role that I was playing as
Yeah.
pastor and as therapist. What freed him, I think, was the writing of the book and coming to terms with the ways in which, having lived a closeted life in the way that they did, they weren't closeted altogether, by the way.
Yeah.
I can talk about that later, but he was aware that they chose to live in separate houses, and he couldn't get back those years. And he couldn't get back the years in which they decided to drop a hand if they were expressing affection toward one another, or not kiss one another because they were afraid of embarrassing the public or being an embarrassment or being discovered. He couldn't get those years back. And when I met him and he was in grief, he was talking about regrets. And so I pressed him on the whole idea of openness, and I really helped him to begin to bear witness to coming out to his brother, first of all. So I was a witness to it as a writer in real time, watching him make the decision, which is more about individuation than it was about activism. If you know Carl Jung's idea about individuation, we all have a responsibility for understanding our unique selves on this planet. And what keeps us from that really keeps us from living our full life. And Jung says over and over that our true destiny, our best destinies in life, is to discover who we are and to let that presence be known to all the people that we love. So it's less about coming out of a closet as it's been come to known, and more about claiming who you are as a human being with the people that you love. And that's how I was positioning it to him then. Don't you want to know your brother? Don't you want your brother to know you? You're both getting older. And so he made the progress to speak to his brother, and then to speak to his local church, and then to let people interview him about his life as a gay activist, which he was. And yeah, so I think that partly it was grief, but partly it was being pressed in this idea about this is your time to be truthful about yourself and to be open with the people that you love, because if you don't do it now, you might not ever get the opportunity. And that's when the whole scripture of 1 John came up. There's no fear in love, but perfect love or mature love casts out all fear. That he began to bear witness to in his life and meditate on. And I think it freed him a little bit to be present in the world as he was. I hope so.
Yeah. Thank you. Stephen, I want to pivot a bit to the United Church of Christ and start with my introduction to Bob, as I mentioned earlier, was the book Christ and the Homosexual. So this amazing book published 66 years ago under his own name as a minister at enormous professional risk. And your book notes that Bob borrowed against his life insurance policy. It was a self-published book. The unfortunate term used is vanity press, right?
Right.
And, this act of financial self-sacrifice says something about the sense of urgency he felt. And I also remember clearly from my conversations with Bob and then the article I wrote about the book, Christ and the Homosexual, that he saw as an important part of his ministry pushing the denomination, the United Church of Christ, toward what he would have called gay inclusion, right? And I think his work helped to lay the foundations in part, right, for Open and Affirming Coalition. Your book notes also that some UCC leaders attacked this book in 1960s. Others laughed. Several people counseled patients, telling Bob the church had other priorities than homosexuals. How do you think Bob absorbed these rebuffs from many people at that time in the early 60s, perhaps later in the UCC, without losing a sense of vocation? What kept him going?
Well, I think that this book, believe it or not, and Bob was aware of it, is really a story about navigating life in a heteronormative culture. I think he became aware of it pretty quickly when he was when returning to the University of Pennsylvania, beginning to encounter a different form of faith that was judgmental about gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered people, using the Bible as a weapon to make judgments against them. He was really feeling all that pretty intensely. And then he was in a theological setting that was being taught by all heterosexual men. Um, Theologians, as far as I know, and biblical scholars were all heterosexual men again in his day. And anytime he had a chance to raise a question about homosexuality in those contexts, he was rebuffed every single time. So that by the time he got to Manhattan and Mattachine, um, he was, well, angry. And he was wanting to say, you know, make a case for a kind of form of faith that he had to create on his own. And I want all the listeners to understand this. You can get all the help you can and the guidance you can get from a theological education, but if it doesn't apply to you personally, you've got to figure out how to make that application present for yourself. That's the real art of this book and his own theological and biblical scholarship in those years of study and careful academic rigor. He found a way to apply to himself as a gay man what was not permitted to be. And I
And
think
what's remarkable, about that book is the way in which he does bring in Bible ethics, pastoral concerns. And one of my favorite lines in the book is one that I heard Bob himself say to me when I asked, of course, what did the congregational members at the church in Spring Valley say when you shared? He gave copies of the book to people on the leadership team, and he said there was only one comment, and someone said something like, "He certainly seems to know what he's talking about."
That's it.
Yeah,
Can you believe that?
This is a book that begins with a dungeon scene in New York City. I want to pivot to one of our participants' questions, and I'll try to read this through, and I hope I get it. This is from Roy. Did Bob ever mention Alfred A. Gross, George Henry's clerical amanuensis? Gross spoke at the same Interchurch Center conference on homosexuality that Bob emceed, and there may be a follow-up here that I want to find in the thread. There was a social network of contemporaries that was kind of an army. Bishop Donegan and his gay staff at St. John the Divine, a couple of gay couples, Canon Jones, etc. So the first part of the question, and then, sorry, he transformed, this is Roy still speaking in the chat, he transformed those UCC post-World War II denominational executives. I encountered them 20 years later, and he had turned them 180 degrees.
Yeah. And, that's Mattachine. Again, there were a lot of people working in New York at the time. And you're right to point out all these people. I don't know exactly that person that he mentioned, if Bob had an awareness of him. I apologize. I can't remember that Bob spoke of him specifically. But I know that his involvement in Mattachine brought him in touch with Frank Camney and Dick Leitch. And these people who were doing amazing work. Of course, there were sort of tensions in their style. There were also tensions in geography, the Washington, D.C. versus the New York versus the West Coast. There were a little bit of tensions in all that being worked out amongst the leaders there. But, basically they were trying to encourage professionals to take responsibility for activism in whatever way they could. And I know Dick Leitch particularly encouraged Robert Wood to get serious in engaging the United Church of Christ. So that's a causally linked connection. Bob's work with the Mattachine brought him into an awareness of how activism could be effective, and he was challenged. Dick Leitch would say things like, find the people in power, write letters, send articles, be persistent, don't give up, look for action, not talk. And of course, Bob was
joined the march in front of the White House, right? He was there, right?
Exactly. And so here he was, he might have been well-meaning in his theology, but he's got someone that's living a different kind of political truth. And he's
Yeah.
saying, look, you're going to be a hypocrite if you don't stand up. And so I have to say that there was a tension between these movements like Mattachine and others. Barbara Gidding was a part of that mix as well, a hugely important person, and Frank Camney and others. They were really trying to do their best to not lose their jobs, not get put in jail, but at the same time challenge the people in power. So in Bob's case, specifically to your question about the UCC, he looked for potential advocates and found some in the United Church of Christ Board for Homeland Ministries, where you would expect them to be. And that's where he sort of began to reach out to people and write letters. And I'm glad that we included some of the correspondence from real people that he had protected in his archives that showed that resistance. That's not something he was remembering. We could show that in real terms.
Yeah.
You try to encourage a person that has a responsibility for the entire church life, and you're one small part of that church life, and people are in disagreement with who you are and what you're saying. So I'm thinking of Truman Douglas particularly as I'm speaking, who wrote.
And a shout out here, since we're here on LGBTQ RAN, they're hosting us and co-sponsoring with us. A shout out to the importance of archives. When I made a few visits to the Congregational Library, having before me those couple of days, as you say, the war diaries of Bob and everything else, letters and poems and sermons, was just astounding.
Yeah.
Stephen, I appreciate the fact that the foreword to your book was written by Bennett Guess, who's described as the first openly gay person to be elected executive minister and national officer for the United Church of Christ. How do you track or read the arc from Bob's, I think what Bob would say was his lonely, risky advocacy within the church and outside of the church in the early 1960s, to the moment of an openly gay person in this position of leadership? And do you think Bob felt that he lived to see enough of that trajectory to feel that his work had borne fruit? Because what I sensed from him was a lack of appreciation on the part of many, both in the church and outside of, and really hungry for recognition. Do you think he was able to see a trajectory to that, I don't want to say the promised land, but to a better present that he lived to see?
I think he came to terms with the fact that the world had changed during his lifetime, and that he might have had something to do with it. I think he would have acknowledged the fact that Bill Johnson was the first openly gay pastor ordained. He would have been really enthused about that movement. I think he would also maybe recognize that he played a part in cracking open a door to make that kind of thing happen, and also eventually to have GLBTQ leadership within the denominations, in the instrumentalities, out and openly GLBTQ people working in those very denominational entities. He wouldn't claim credit for their work, but I think he would take something away that he had cracked the door open a little bit. I think he felt frustrated that I think he did all that he was prepared to do and could do, being a pastor for 36 years without missing a Sunday service. That still stunned me. So people sort of have to keep in mind that he remained faithful to a vocation in a way that I thought was pretty remarkable, and did what he could, around that.
Stephen, reviewers, a couple of reviewers, I love reading book reviews after I've read a book to see what people think of it. And several reviewers, and you got some great reviews, described your book as really a book written for the present moment. And, given the current rollbacks of LGBTQ plus rights, especially with regard to trans people, trans women of color, and this renewed hostility certainly on the part of our federal government, but also in some religious institutions. What do you hope readers, and I'm thinking particularly people of faith, might take from Bob's story at this moment?
Well, if you're GLBTQ people, I think he would say to you, don't lose heart. You're going to have to press on with your own belief in yourself. And you might have to face some circumstances that are challenging, but you won't have to do it alone as I did. You know, there are really great scholars all around the world now who are pushing forward the conversation in theological circles about GLBTQ and biblical history and theological life in rich and wonderful ways. He would say, don't lose heart, but don't trust people outside of your own experience to define your experience for you. He would often use that caution big time. And he would say to the people who are heterosexuals in our communities, look, you know, the heteronormative culture itself is a divided one. In some ways, it's miraculous. I just spoke to a group recently in which I really felt that miracle here in a small village, not in a big city, with a group of about 75 people coming to hear me talk about this book. And I looked out at them and I didn't take a poll, but I did say at the beginning, looking at you, you all seem to be heterosexuals to me. Raise your hand. They all did, kind of sheepishly. And I said, you know, you represent something of a miracle to me, and that you're here and that you're engaging me about this book. And here's why. You are not the heteronormative culture that Reverend Wood grew up in with. You're not. So I'm understanding that there's a part of our heteronormative culture that has gone through an evolution, whether it's education, whether it's exposure, whether it's just human decency, kindness, I don't know. I think it's a great study to figure out why it is some heterosexuals just don't care anymore that you are a GLBTQ person and they're willing to be supportive of you. And as a GLBTQ person, we have to understand that we're living in a heteronormative culture all the time. So we're always a minority. There's nothing we can do about it. It's the facts. There's really nothing. We can't, unless we find a way to procreate ourselves big time. We're just always going to be a minority within a heteronormative culture. And so I say to the heteronormative culture that I feel like is evolving, look, when you read a newspaper article that suggests the Supreme Court has made a decision that impacts someone that happens to be gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, why don't you write them a letter and say you're not in solidarity with that? Don't write your politics all the time. Write to the person who's feeling the pain of the moment of these idiots with whatever kind of agenda that they're working through politically and religiously that feels diminishing to you. Write to those people. Say, I understand that you are precious in the eyes of God. I'm in solidarity with you. Don't listen to that news article. We'll do better. We'll push forward. We'll make this world better and inclusive for all people. We'll hold that vision in solidarity with you. Don't lose hope. Heterosexual people, you have an obligation to be supporting people who are being attacked. You can't abdicate your role in that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, beautifully and powerfully said, Stephen. I'm remembering now reading through correspondence between Bob and people at the was Board of Homeland Ministries, and someone making the comment that Bob would not stop writing letters. He would not leave them alone between one meeting and the next. I know we're coming up to the end of our time. Isaiah had mentioned there was room for another question from folks in the bigger room. A final question, an unfair question, but maybe. In retrospect, is there any question you wish you would have asked Bob? Your book is so comprehensive, but I'm just curious.
What a nice question to ask.
Maybe that's unanswerable, but
I think if I were to land on a question, I would ask him to think about the difference for him. I would ask him to spell it out a little bit more about where desire and and hormones and sexual tension between people. What's the difference between that and the love of commitment and loyalty and heartfelt solidarity between two people over a period of time that he finally found in Hugh?
Hmm.
If he understood it any clearer what that roadmap of discovering Hugh was, I think I would have wanted to just maybe ask him what was going on when you were on Fire Island and you were meeting someone and you engaged in sex with that person and that relationship didn't work out. Or if you were at, returning from war and you're engaged in a sexual relationship with that person, and there were about 5 or 6 different sexual experiences that are named in the book. I would have asked him, what do you think about I project in my comments about it, this is what I project on his behalf, but he never said it. I
Yeah.
project that this was God showing him his path toward his true love.
Yeah.
And that when the relationships didn't work out for Bob, it was just the way he was being directed to find Hugh. And when he found Hugh, then it all sort of fell into place. And so after sex, Hugh didn't leave.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, Hugh began to hang drapes in the,
Yeah, that's right.
the parsonage and showed
Yeah.
up on Sunday worship services.
And
And
then soon Bob met Hugh's father, right? That was
and
also
then
so
they
very
met each
moving.
other's parents. And
Yeah.
so there's something in the dynamic in the whole order of, I'm not diminishing at all sexual pleasure. I mean, who would? But I'm just saying that there's a little bit of a different kind of conversation that might want to happen between intimacy, long-term relationships. How do you forge those kinds of relationships in life? And and do gay people have a lot to teach straight people about the way we manage our affairs? I think we do. From
Wow.
observation.
Stephen, thank you for writing this book. Thank you for speaking with me, with us tonight. And I sincerely encourage people to read the story of Bob. It's a good book. It's a good book and a powerful record, I think, of Bob's life. So thank you for writing it, Stephen.
Oh, thank you so much, Bernie, for entering into it in the very serious way that you did and providing this conversation.
My honor. And thank you, Mark and LGBTQ RAN.
Yeah. Somebody's asking the question, what do we have to teach heteros? Negotiation. The lack of identifying gender roles for everything that has to be arranged domestically. How to have conversations with each other about intimate matters and sexual matters. How to signal what you need in frank conversations in terms of sexuality. And I'm talking about sexual intercourse. I think that the whole business of desire, take that in as a subject. I think we have very strong thoughts about what constitutes desire. I also think, and I might be out of line here, that we have a certain aesthetic that the world needs to be appreciative of. We are many designers, we're dancers, we're musicians, we're many things, and we're thoughtful people, we're thinkers. Bernie, Mark, you understand what scholarship is and how many GLBTQ people are involved in amazing critical thinking. I don't know. I just think the more I know of us, the more I like us.
Good.
I might be a bit biased.
Thank you so much, Bernie and Stephen, for this fascinating and inspiring program. And thanks to all of you who participated and offered comments and questions. If you're interested in more opportunities to explore the history of queer religious movements, check out the LGBTQ RAN website and particularly our events page. There you will find announcements of future online programs, as well as recordings of past presentations. Our next webinar on June 25th, will be a discussion with William Stell, PhD, on his new book, Born Again Queer, A History of Evangelical Gay Activism and the Making of Anti-Gay Christianity. Sign up on the website to get the Zoom link to join this special presentation. Bernie also notes that CLGS has a number of events coming up. Please check out the CLGS website and you can see about those and other programs that CLGS is hosting. On behalf of everyone here, I offer much gratitude to Bernie and Stephen for their enlightening, passionate, and thoughtful discussion. Good night to all.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you.